So I'm going to kick this off by asking each of you a position-defining question, and I'm going to start with Keith. Keith, what are the primary reasons you believe foreign aid should be completely abolished?
When I say American foreign aid, I'm generally referring to resources given or lent by the United States government to a foreign government or group of persons in another country. I want to make the case that all foreign aid should be abolished. According to foreignassistance.gov, as of June 13th, 2025, the U.S. government has over $100 billion in foreign aid obligations, consisting of more than 20,000 activities taking place in 205 countries, primarily Ukraine, Israel, Egypt, and Jordan. According to Pew Research, the American government spent $1.07 trillion on foreign assistance between 2005 and 2024. Foreign aid allows the U.S. government to unilaterally put obligations on their domestic population, us, and use those funds to increase their power and social standing in other parts of the world. The essential issue with government provision of foreign aid is the creation of the service payment split. The people who provide the service do not have to answer to those paying for it. In the case of foreign aid, there's a split between those who pay, taxpayers, those who provide the service, politicians and NGOs, and those who receive the service. In short, those who have the power to control foreign aid funds do not face the discipline necessary to provide high-quality services at a reasonable cost, since the people paying for it do not have a recognized right to stop paying if they don't find value in the project. This would be the equivalent of saying Blockbuster, MySpace, Sears, Toys R Us, and Borders could have resolved their business issues if only they had access to the funds of involuntary investors known as taxpayers. Instead of companies getting money by meeting consumer demand, foreign aid encourages companies to reallocate scarce resources towards complying with the desires of politicians, or, in the words of Michael McClintock, these funds turn entrepreneurs away from pleasing customers and into instruments of statecraft. Not only do politicians with access to trillions of dollars not face the necessary incentives to provide quality aid, but they lack the knowledge of how and where to spend the money effectively. According to the Center for Global Development, total aid given to Africa from wealthy countries since 1960 comes to $4.7 trillion in 2013 prices, even if politicians really wanted to bring democracy and prosperity to Syria, Yemen, Libya, and Ukraine. They don't know how countries become prosperous. If they had such knowledge, we wouldn't see the homelessness and poverty that can be found in many areas of the United States, an area where these same U.S. politicians have much more control and influence. The American people also directly bear the cost of these expenditures. When governments don't have enough money to fund foreign activities through taxing their domestic population, they issue treasury notes, often purchased by the Federal Reserve, who then prints money and increases the amount of dollars in circulation. Increasing the supply of money by trillions of dollars over decades to fund foreign activities results in each dollar Americans hold in their savings accounts being worth less than it otherwise would have been, leading to the inflated prices Americans experience today. Notice, foreign assistance is not a neutral tool that can be used for good or evil, but a structurally unsound way to achieve national security or economic growth. Consider another unintended consequence of foreign aid. Lawrence Wright wrote a book in 2006 titled The Looming Tower, Al-Qaeda and the Road to 9/11, from page 307. On April 11th, 1996, when Muhammad Atta was 27 years old, he signed a standardized will he got from the Al-Quds Mosque. It was the day Israel attacked Lebanon in Operation Grapes of Wrath. According to one of his friends, Atta was enraged, and by filling out his last testament during the attack, he was offering his life in response. When politicians have access to hundreds of billions of dollars, they do not have the knowledge or incentive to make sure these funds are used in such a way to keep Americans safe. Consider the words of U.S. Assistant Secretary to European and Eurasian Affairs Victoria Nuland in December of 2013. We've invested over $5 billion to assist Ukraine in these and other goals that will ensure a secure and prosperous and democratic Ukraine. American politicians should not have the capacity to spend billions of dollars considering their previous pet projects have resulted in tremendous devastation. To summarize my position, Foreign aid allows politicians to spend the money Americans work for with virtually no accountability, and voters do not have the time or mental bandwidth to pressure politicians into spending the money in a desirable manner. Therefore, reforming foreign aid is a fool's errand because it empowers people without the knowledge or incentives necessary to achieve their goals. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Keith. Cenk, your position is in favor of foreign aid. So what specific benefits does foreign aid provide to both recipient countries and the donor nation's strategic interests?
Yeah, it has four specific benefits. I hope that tonight we also talk about much, much better things to cut, because there are a ton of those. I'll start with $17 billion a year in oil subsidies. So there's no reason why you should take from the average person and give to the richest corporations in the world. And that doesn't help solve malaria or HIV at all. So there's a lot of our government that is filled with waste and total and utter corruption. $400 billion the Pentagon can't account for. And we're fighting over 1% of the budget here. Okay, but let's fight over it. So the four places why I think the aid helps us tremendously, it is number one on moral issues. So if some of you say, oh, I don't care about no stinking morals, I think you actually do. And we'll come back to that. Number two is national security. It's very important. Number three is economic issues. And number four is our brand, the brand of America. Okay. So on moral issues, look, I don't have to convince people on the left that we should help children and not get malaria or tuberculosis or have people avoid HIV. So on the right, I hope I don't have to convince you of that. And it was actually George W. Bush in probably his best program ever that helped to save millions of lives in Africa and across the world by fighting AIDS. But also some of the things that were cut were related to child and maternal health. And so if you're pro-life, this has saved millions of kids' lives. In fact, it's not just us, but USAID was an enormous part of it. Since 1990, the number of kids under the age of 5 that have died has been cut in half. So as an American, no matter where you are on the political spectrum, you should be enormously proud of that. On moral grounds, alone, I would do it, right? But now let's get to the other issues that are very much, related to our economic and security interests. So on the economy, if you take away essential food services, what winds up happening is there's a fight over resources. So that leads to refugees, that leads to migrant waves, it leads to insecurity. And then we have to go in and fix it and spend a lot more money. Then we have to try to do nation building, which I don't want. I know a lot of people on here don't want. It's much, much harder to fix after it gets broken than to help a little bit before it gets broken. And look, imagine, the refugee waves we would have had from Germany, for example, to the rest of Europe alone, or Japan to the rest of Asia and to the US after World War II if we had not done the Marshall Plan. Because those countries were devastated. They look a lot like Gaza does today. And instead of having those people flow out or create new conflicts, after all, World War I and II arose out of Germany, but World War III apparently not going to come from Germany and Japan because we did the Marshall Plan and we were smart and we gave assistance there, but that assistance wound up helping us tremendously. And now Germany and Japan are among our top 2 economic partners. They're in our military alliances. So that was smart to do that, not just moral, but smart and strategic. Now, when it comes to national security, there's also other issues. There's threats that come out of radicals that arise in desperation, in desperate situations. So when you have civil unrest, when you have disease spreading, cholera spreading, and you have lack of food, lack of water, it is almost invariably going to lead to conflict. And conflict and civil war leads to radicalism. And then a lot of times religious fundamentalism and radicalism. And then that spreads and spreads and then eventually winds up on American shores, again, costing American lives and a lot of American money to fight it here and abroad when we could have just spent a little bit to avoid that from the get-go. And then finally on the brand, if you think the brand's not important, I think that's wrong. So for all the reasons I stated already on economic and military issues, so we have less immigrants, less refugees, less war, less disease, etc. But also because the dollar is dependent on our brand. The world uses the dollar, and that is probably the most important economic thing there is. And so, and part of the reason that they do that is because we have this amazing reputation overall. We have a lot of hits to that reputation, and there's a lot we got to fix about that reputation, especially these days as we fund genocide, etc. But the one thing that has helped to keep our brand up and having a lot of the world respect us and love us, and by the way, get into both military and economic alliances with us, is because our brand is so strong and we're known for human rights. We're the people who spread human rights throughout the world, and we have helped so many of these countries. If we leave that arena, what's going to happen is China is going to fill the void. And then China is going to build their brand, and China is going to build their economic and military alliances, and also, by the way, get natural resources from a lot of these countries where we could have. Now, it doesn't mean that I think we should take their natural resources. I think that we should do deals, and they'll trust us to do those deals if we've been this great magnanimous country as we have before. And guys, again, all of this in well under 1% of our budget, when there is massive waste, fraud, and abuse elsewhere that we could easily tackle.
Thank you so much, Cenk. Mike, what specific flaws in the current foreign aid system and USAID specifically do you believe require reform, and why?
Well, asking about the flaws in USAID is basically like asking about the flaws at CIA. USAID is at heart a CIA function. You cannot have a USAID grant without it having some connectivity to soft power projection that advances the State Department's foreign policy goals. And USAID is used in order to accomplish those soft power goals through a philanthropic front. So all these programs, whether it be about food security or public health or independent media or rule of law programs, you name it, these are secretly accomplishing some goal that the State Department wants to achieve. At least that's what it's supposed to be. That's at its best. That's leaving aside kickbacks, the way this money comes home to support political apparatus. I'm here kind of to listen to both sides of this, and I find myself sort of in a kind of middle position between both Keith and Cenk on this. I'll address what I see as the ways to rectify those flaws, which is what the Trump administration is doing, shutting down the agency of USAID and then preserving a function for foreign aid, but putting it at the State Department. And the reason this is being done is because USAID is one of the most secret places in all of the US government. I always say when it's too dirty for the CIA, you give it to USAID. And this is because when the CIA does covert action, it has to be approved by the President of the United States in the form of a presidential finding. There needs to be written sign-off for covert action by the CIA. USAID does not need to do that. They can run covert action programs and simply call them discrete democracy promotion, and then it can be run underneath a president's nose without him even knowing about it. This is how Trump 1 was deceived by his own USAID. And you had essentially an independent parallel foreign policy being accomplished at the executive branch when the President of the United States is supposed to be the determiner of all U.S. foreign policy decisions. But there's only one method of accountability at USAID, and that is the Inspector General at USAID. USAID can block Congress from oversight. USAID is supposed to be accountable to the House Foreign Affairs Committee and to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. In a funny scandal in 2014, when the public grant that was given out from 2009 to 2014 for a program called Zunzaneo was earmarked for humanitarian relief in Pakistan, what they actually did is they ran those funds through a series of offshore banks in the Cayman Islands and used it to construct an alternative Twitter knockoff in order to end run Cuba's ban on Twitter. So publicly, you're looking at a grant that says it's saving lives in Pakistan, but secretly what's happening is a whole Twitter knockoff app for Cubans to orchestrate what USAID called a Cuban Spring, that is a regime change operation to topple a government, even though publicly it looks like it's being done for humanitarian relief in Pakistan. And what happened during that scandal during the Obama administration is when this regime change operation got busted, Obama denied any knowledge of it because he didn't give a presidential finding. And the Congress and Senate, the House and Senate said, we didn't know this was happening. We thought the program was totally different. In fact, the lead analyst for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee said that USAID blocked oversight from knowing what the program details were. In his own words, he was the most senior CIA analyst for Latin America during the Clinton administration, and then went on to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. What he said is, in Congress, we were told we could not be told, quote, even in broad terms, what this program was about, or else people would die. So that justification blocks Congress, blocks the president, and it can all be kept in-house, which is why USAID is the preferred vehicle of rogue CIA activities and has a 3 times bigger budget than the CIA does formally. And what I'm saying with this is shutting down USAID and making it more accountable and transparent by parking it within the transparent books of the State Department is the way to do foreign aid. Now, on the topic of foreign aid itself, I'll try to make this quick to get this back. Looking at it honestly and perhaps cynically, if you will, but simply seeing it for what it is, when you understand these kind of covert action activities to be a way to advance the profits of U.S. companies, corporations, financial firms, and by process, we're told the economy of Americans and jobs and access to natural resources, you don't want to be a country that has no function whatsoever to be able to influence the course of events in foreign countries. You would not have the power projection of U.S. multinational corporations. You would not have the competitiveness of them against Chinese companies or European companies or Russian energy companies unless you had some way to project influence into other countries to influence the course of their events. It's easy to say, get rid of this altogether, but then watch what happens as our own companies lose to other companies who are being backed by their government through the flow of foreign aid funds. And you'll be living in a country that is basically outflanked, and that's not good for anyone. So the issue is foreign aid has gotten way too rogue. It has become such a dominant force in covert action that it has lost the trust, not just of the American people, but internationally. There were a dozen countries to welcome the shutdown of USAID. In the past decade, USAID has been expelled from 8 different countries because now countries are seeing through it for what it is. It may be the case that in the future, a USAID 2.0 can be launched as a totally independent agency from the ground up after its function has been streamlined, but it has gone way too rogue, and it has to go into the shop for repairs before this thing is driven out on the road again.
Thank you, Mike. Keith, how would you address the humanitarian crises that Cenk referenced without foreign aid?
Well, I believe that Cenk is conflating foreign aid with trade deals. So he's not differentiating between when the U.S. government taxes the population and sends that money overseas versus when companies contract with other companies between nations. So the examples of Japan and Germany that he used, I thought those were excellent examples because we trade with Germany roughly $250 billion a year, with Japan roughly $220 billion a year. I think trade deals are the solution to any potential animosity that could happen, whether it's between people, counties, states, or countries. So I think trade would be a much better approach as opposed to putting obligations on the domestic population to send money overseas. One of the great historical examples of, Cenk used the word, the American brand, I love that verbiage, comes from a book by Walter LaCour, A History of Zionism from the French Revolution to the Establishment of the State of Israel. He says, the Balfour Declaration had not provided a clear answer with regard to the identity of the protecting power. The American King Crane Commission in 1919 reported that the Arab Muslims, the great majority of the population, were in favor of Syrian independence, and that a mandate over a united Syria, including Palestine, should be assigned to the Americans, or as a second choice, to the British. So a lot of what politicians say are these deep-seated hatreds that go back to 600 AD that we just can't get over, that we either need to fight wars over or stage regime change wars in order to have good relations with other countries. I don't think that is the case. I think free trade and the trade deals of Germany and Japan, as opposed to the Export Control Act of 1940, which completely ruined American and Japanese relations and later resulting in Pearl Harbor. So I think the more free trade is a much better way to achieve our desired ends of helping people, not only domestically who are impoverished, but in foreign lands as well.
Cenk, you may respond.
Yeah, so I want to respond to a couple of things. So first off, this idea of throwing out the baby with the bathwater makes no sense to me. So are there programs in USAID that the overwhelming majority of Americans would agree with? Yes, of course there are. So when you talk about maternal and child health care and saving the lives of fetuses, newborn babies, moms, I'd be shocked if the U.S. population wasn't in favor of spending a small amount of money to make that happen, just on moral grounds alone. So let alone all the other positive benefits that come out of it. And yes, trade deals are one of the benefits. Maybe you could do a trade deal without humanitarian assistance, but does it make it more likely for that population, both the government and the population, the citizens of those countries, to want to be in an alliance with America? Well, of course it does, right? So did Germany, the people of Germany and Japan, want to be in an alliance with us right after World War II? No. We had just nuked Japan and we had firebombed Dresden and so many other German cities. They hated us. But our help, our assistance wound up creating tremendous goodwill. And that was partly what led to the trade deals that were so beneficial to us, right? And so can you find some things in USAID that are not helpful? Of course you can. You could in any program, right? So Mike says, hey, I know that some of these are CIA programs. Here's how we know. And here's how these CIA programs were not helpful. Maybe one or two were, but 3 or 4 were terrible, right? I'd believe that. And if you could show me that or other fraud or waste, then why would I be opposed to cutting that? I want to spend aid in the right way, not in the wrong way. So I think what would have been a healthy way to handle all of this is coming in and going, okay, we're going to investigate this, not over the course of 6 years or commission to study it for 18 months, but we're going to put real manpower on figuring out what are the parts of U.S. aid we should keep, what are the parts that are clearly wrong. And my guess is that you would have found only a small number of those. And then, by the way, there'll be a third bucket of ones in the middle where we can debate it. Hey, is that a CIA program or isn't it? And that would be an interesting and fun debate. And if we could out some of those and say, hey, that one was not at all helpful, then I'm very happy to have that conversation and that debate. And you got to push through a lot of misinformation about what USAID was spending its money on. So if you heard some of those abuses, they were almost all not true. But if there are some that you could find that are true, thrilled to cut it. I don't want to waste a single dollar of American taxpayer money. So I think all these things work together. So I actually think that they're kind of making my case for me. So some of this is about national security. You could argue that, hey, not every program we've done in that direction has been helpful and some have been counterproductive. And I would definitely hear you out on that argument. And then we should make those decisions based on those specific programs that are problematic, instead of just throwing out the entire budget, the entire program, which overall has been enormously helpful. Look, again, one last thing. If you don't know, just on HIV alone, we have saved about 25 million lives. And HIV then would have spread across the globe a lot more if we hadn't done that. It is one of the crowning achievements of a Republican president, George W. Bush, that did that. And if you're a Republican or you're an American, you should be super proud of that. So do not throw the baby out with the bathwater. In the case of USAID, kind of literally, right? And if you find some bad bathwater, nobody wants an infection. Let's get it out of here, right? But keep the baby and keep the programs, because yes, they do help on national security often. And yes, they definitely help with trade deals, our brand, and preventing waves of migrants from coming here.
Thank you,
Well,
Cenk.
Can
Mike,
I
you can
respond?
respond to that. Yes.
Well, let's talk about the babies in the bathwater, because I see a lot of bathwater and very little baby. Specifically on the babies, because Cenk, I've heard you refer to, that this should be a kind of broad coalition issue because of concerns about Republicans and pro-life. In 1998, a congressional amendment had to get passed to bar USAID from doing forced sterilizations because USAID was found involved assisting the government of Peru as it forcibly sterilized about 300,000 people. USAID is completely all over the abortion game in Africa, in India, in Latin America. So right there, you have the opposite of saving babies. USAID is actually taking the lives of babies, at least as pro-life folks see it. You mentioned HIV. I'm not sure if you're familiar, for example, in 2014 with the massive USAID HIV scandal, where USAID was busted running a covert regime change operation in Cuba, basically getting people from Costa Rica, Puerto Rico, Nicaragua, Guatemala to set up HIV prevention programs in Cuba. USAID referred to these documents internally as being, quote, the perfect excuse to recruit people for street revolutions against the Cuban government, because no one would think to look at an HIV program in Cuban counterintelligence as being the locus for recruiting offices. So if they were busted in Latin America in 2014, this is not ancient history, this is the Obama administration, for using HIV programs to run covert regime change operations, how many HIV clinics in Africa are doing this? How many HIV programs in Pakistan and Afghanistan and Bangladesh are doing this? In 2012, the CIA was busted running a fake vaccine program in Pakistan to secretly collect the DNA and biometrics of the entire local population. Now, CIA ran that operation through a USAID-funded outfit called Save the Children. We're back to this supposed baby in the bathwater. This British NGO called Save the Children, which had deep reach inside of Pakistan, partnered with USAID. The doctors who were recruited to actually run that operation were handpicked from USAID officials at Save the Children in order to collect the DNA and biometrics for the Central Intelligence Agency. So the public saw a hepatitis B vaccine drive. They saw it from Save the Children, but what they were actually doing is giving all of their blood and biometric data to the Central Intelligence Agency to be used in a covert counterterrorism drive. That does not engender goodwill. Save the Children was actually expelled from Pakistan over that. And I think this is now the growing reputation of USAID, as you always need to ask the question, what is it doing versus what does it say it's doing versus what is it really doing? This is the same thing with these starvation, Band-Aid and Live Aid and all these USAID-assisted food, starvation programs in East Africa to Somalia and Sudan and Uganda. It came out, BBC actually produced a documentary showing that of the $100 million raised for that famine relief program, 95 million of it went to purchase guns for CIA-backed rebels in the local civil war in Somalia. So none of these things do what they say that they do. And this is because USAID is an independent agency with no oversight. At least at the State Department, you can pick and choose about which ones are best for national security or best for American value projection without it all being rolled up as a kind of CIA conduit.
To follow up on that, Mike, real quick, in your research, have you found anything salvageable at USAID?
Yes, I think that Cenk, for example, mentioned things like the Marshall Plan and how it did secure U.S. interests in Europe as it was reconstructing. The Marshall Plan itself was deeply connected to the Central Intelligence Agency. Much of the Marshall Plan funds had to be matched by the recipient countries for use by the local CIA station house. In 1948, George Kennan's memo called the Inauguration of Organized Political Warfare, 2 months before the CIA was granted its plausible deniability license, explicitly mentioned the need for covert organized political warfare in order to ensure the aims of the Marshall Plan. But the fact is for investment of capital in foreign countries in order to secure U.S. interests is the reason that we have the multinational corporation strength that we do. It's the reason that we have access to critical minerals. For example, how do you get access to the cobalt in the Democratic Republic of Congo? How do you get access to oil, aluminum, copper, lithium, nickel, copper? A lot of this is juiced by USAID. The issue is, and this is something that China does as well, although through typically more infrastructure-oriented investments than values-based projection. The issue is we have our own civil war in this country at a cultural level about what those values are. For example, we will fund transgender dance festivals with USAID money. And it's a question about whether or not that is actually consistent with U.S. interests. But then you need to do the double math. Well, is it actually the International Republican Institute who is cynically funding the transgender dance festivals in Bangladesh because that population is opposed to the government we want to topple, and we want to install a new government so that Houston oil companies can get access to the petroleum? The issue is we have a way too broad issue set of the kinds of things that we do this kind of USAID covert action in. It has become the default go-to. And for example, free speech diplomacy was a huge part of USAID from the 1960s through the 1990s. USAID funded journalists, legal support for journalists outfits, funded media organizations, funded essentially pushes to national congresses and parliaments in order to get more liberalized free speech laws in countries. Now, this was done for the cynical, self-serving, CIA-adjacent purpose of allowing U.S.-backed dissident movements in the country to have more press freedom so that they could popularize ideas against communism. But the fact is, they were at least in that process appealing to universal values. Now USAID is doing the opposite. They're actually pressuring countries to censor their internet in order to control the rise and fall of different political movements. When we want to topple a country, USAID promotes free speech. When we want to stabilize a regime that's threatened by a rising political party, USAID pushes those governments to pass censorship laws. And this has become way too schizophrenic. It all needs to be pared down and streamlined so that only the essential things to U.S. national security and national interest are genuinely preserved.
Thank you, Mike. Cenk, how do you address critics who would argue that foreign aid often fails to reach the intended beneficiaries due to corruption or mismanagement, such as in USAID?
Yeah, I have a relatively straightforward answer to that. So, like when Trump came in office, they do Doge and they say, okay, we're going to cut all of USAID. Well, hold on. You didn't even see which parts are good, which parts are bad, which parts are essential, which parts help America, which parts don't. And how could you know where the corruption is if you cut the whole thing? So, look, a lot of Mike's case against USAID is actually a case against the CIA. And I share a lot of his concerns. And so if you want to show examples from the 1960s, the 80s, and beyond of the CIA misusing USAID or any other part of our government, I'm super happy to correct that, right? So like the forced sterilizations from back in the 1980s, terrible. It doesn't help anyone. And I'm glad we found it. I'm glad we took it out, right? So on the issues of abortion and trans music festivals, if that actually exists, we can debate it and we could say, hey, you know what? Maybe that's not a good use of our money. And others might say, hey, no, look, helping women with healthcare is a great use of our money, right? But that's a good debate for us to have. But just to say, okay, let's just stop all of it feels thoughtless, feels like and by that I mean, we're not putting much thought into it. We're not trying to adjudicate what the good parts are and what the bad parts are. So if you show me a portion of USAID that you actually have evidence for is a CIA program for regime change, and I will work with you to get that program out of USAID, right? Because I agree that doesn't help. It actually hurts our brand. And when the CIA uses good meaning programs where we're saying we're saving the children to actually covertly do other things that are in our interest. I don't mean general things like helping the brand, helping alliances, etc. I mean covert programs that Mike and Keith are sometimes referring to. that is deeply counterproductive, both to the aid and to our alliances and to our national interests, and we waste money on it. So I'd be super happy to take those out. So they've mentioned a number of examples through like literally the decades of USAID's work. But that's, to me, yes, we can have an argument about, is that the molehill? Is that the mountain? Is that the needle or is that the haystack, right? And so the haystack, we know is there. We know USAID has helped because of the stats that we already know. So, for example, when you talk about saving the children, well, you could say, hey, some of the programs they didn't save the children, and some of them were actually covert regime change plans, et cetera. Okay, that's fine. But since 1990, the number of kids dying under the age of 5 has gone down by half. The proof is in the pudding. Again, we're not solely responsible for that, but USAID was an enormous part of that. We saved millions upon millions of children's lives. That's real. That's the haystack. That's what USAID is. But you find me toxic programs in there or corruption in there, and I'd love to get it out because it not only hurts the country, but it hurts USAID. And I don't want that getting hurt. And so, like, if there is a thoughtful way of saying, oh, and one other thing that's important, it's the reason why a lot of these cuts got blocked by the courts is because Congress had already appropriated that money. So you can't go backwards and say, all right, I'm overruling Congress after both Congress passed it and a president signed it into that law into effect. But what you can do and should do is say, all right, here's all of its programs for next year. Let me show you all the corruption that Mike's talking about or Keith is talking about. We're going to take those out and we're going to keep the parts that make sense or good for the world, good for America, et cetera. Then everybody would go, oh, that's a reasonable way to do it. Yes, let's do that. So then the courts wouldn't have to overrule you. You're not doing anything unconstitutional. You're not doing anything where you're just coming in and by definition saying, I'm not thinking about this and I don't care what's corruption and what's waste. I'm just going to get rid of the whole thing and set us back. Don't do that. Take out just the problems that are parts that are problematic. That seems like the obvious solution.
I want to let Keith, I know that we've been having some back and forth, but I would like to respond to that, I guess, after Keith gets in.
I don't have anything in particular on that if you want to take over.
Great. So a couple things there. And I see your concerns there, Cenk. And I actually think that we're not all that far apart on this. It's kind of about the structure and sequence for that. But I want to kind of rattle off a few things there. So first of all, this is not ancient history at all. This, for example, when I mentioned the Save the Children, the USAID funded it, Save the Children NGO in Pakistan for the fake vaccine drive run by the CIA. That was 2012 to 2014 is when the CIA finally said, we're not going to use vaccine programs as cover for CIA operations anymore. It took them 18 months after that was busted by the Associated Press, Reuters, and covered internationally. But that was the Obama administration, not ancient history. In terms of all of the good that these programs have done, I've just rattled off, I think, in my last response, about a half a dozen, from HIV programs to sterilization programs to food relief programs that are all going to either do regime change or guns. And then you cited that we know the good work that USAID has done. And I'd like to challenge you on that. How do you know that? Is it by reading the USAID press releases? Have you tried FOIAing USAID to see what they actually are doing in that case? Good luck on that. You're not going to be able to get transparency about a single USAID program. And let me address two things sort of further to that. So you mentioned that there are parts of USAID that should be preserved in terms of the function. I believe that the agency needs to be shut down. And to the extent that it should be an independent agency rather than a subsidiary State Department function, it may be the case that in the future, there is a kind of USAID 2.0 from a clean slate without having the dirty reputation that it has as it's being expelled by countries around the world. And a dozen world leaders have come out and celebrated Trump's actions on this. But the fact is USAID has an entire office called OTI, the Office of Transition Initiatives. What do they mean by transition? they mean a democratic transition. And if you know Diplo speak, that means regime change. That is an office of regime change. Every single grant by USAID's Office of Transition Initiatives is an office to transition the current government of a country to the next government, which will be more pliant to so-called U.S. national interest or national security. It is an entire office at USAID explicitly for regime change. Even the New York Times wrote about this as being essentially a parallel CIA branch, and that maybe they should change the branding because it doesn't look so good when grants come from there. So in terms of that function, perhaps I'd agree, unless you simply want to that gets to the question about the role of the CIA and whether there's CIA reorganization on this. But part of the reason you can't get transparency about USAID, you mentioned national security a few times, and the role. I agree, by the way, with one of the statements that you made, I think, in the opening salvo about the role of USAID in national security. You are not alone in that. USAID's prime lobbying group, called the U.S. Global Leadership Conference, explicitly made the push beginning in 1995 that we need to pump up USAID's budget rather than wind it down since the Cold War ended, because this is a method for getting political control over the Central and Eastern European countries that we were fighting to gobble up as part of NATO expansion. But the fact is everything USAID does has to be coordinated with the Pentagon. In every operating theater, there is a council, there's joint planning between in every theater that USAID operates, that the Pentagon operates. They have to do joint theater planning. They have to do constant coordination in the run-up to Pentagon activity through its entire continuation. This is something that's called the 3D model, defense, diplomacy, development, which means everything USAID does has to be constantly synchronized in every region, in every industry, with the Pentagon and the State Department's plans there. If you want to see what a food relief program is really doing in Somalia, you should see what it's saying to the Pentagon and the State Department about how that food program assists those goals. Good luck getting transparency about that. Even Congress can't get it, the specific wings of Congress that oversee USAID. It is more secret than the Central Intelligence Agency. At least there is a mandatory declassification period where things are up for review by CIA. And again, there is a presidential finding that can be audited in terms of what that program was really doing. But there's not a single program, and I would, if you can name one where every document about that program is publicly available, you're going to be the world's first person to see it. And so I don't think a single one of these is really doing what it says it's doing. It actually really can't, because USAID is not a charity. It is a soft power mechanism to use philanthropic fronts to accomplish some aim. But since you can't subpoena it, you can't FOIA it, you can't get deep inside the guts of it, and the only way we know is through leaks, there has to be a more accountable mechanism. If these things are really, if there really is a baby there, they should be able to show that baby to the world and allow us to kiss it.
Thank you, Mike. Cenk, would you like to respond?
Yeah, definitely. So first of all, I see we've got conservatives against transitioning in all forms, gender and regimes. So I join you on being against transitioning regimes. But Mike, you seem like you're constantly just making an argument against the CIA. And here, brother. Okay, I mean, you want to talk about a nefarious organization that does things completely in secret, totally counterproductive in everything that's ever been revealed about them, and has done great damage to the country. Yeah, that's the CIA. So it's like if the CIA is using different parts of our government, USAID, Pentagon, State Department, the problem isn't the State Department and the Pentagon in those cases. The problem is the CIA using those departments in nefarious ways. And so on those abuses, I join you completely. But when you talk about, hey, we don't have accountability here, but that's kind of a catch-all, right? Because in terms of transparency, first of all, the Pentagon has never passed an audit in their lives, right? And they say outlandish things like, we can't account for $400 billion. So the entire remaining USAID budget is $69 billion. So here, I'll cut $400 billion that they can't find at the Pentagon and save you a lot more money, right? And probably get rid of a lot more CIA programs. Okay, and so that's part of it here. And by the way, I can show you. I mean, cut after cut. Medicare Advantage has this giant scam part of it where they send in the nurses and send fake bills to the U.S. government. We all know that it's happening, but since those companies are greasing both Republican and Democratic politicians, we lose $100 to $200 billion a year to that robbery, and there's no transparency there. I mean, you want to talk about transparency? When are we going to get the Epstein files? Okay, so there's no transparency anywhere in the government. So just saying, hey, USAID does not have good transparency, really, again, that critique could be done to any department. And if you say to me, hey, I'm in favor of more transparency at USAID or anywhere else, again, here, brother. I'd like to get as much transparency as possible. I'd love to have the FOIA requests be answered. But if you're in the Trump team, or if you were in the Biden team earlier, right, you're in charge of the government, then you don't get to make that argument because you don't need a FOIA request. You're in charge of the government. You know what's inside, right? So like the Trump administration could just go, oh, here's a crappy program by USAID. It turns out it was actually led by the CIA and was trying to do regime change in Peru for no goddamn reason, okay? And we're throwing it in the garbage. And the American people would cheer. And they go, oh, okay, you showed me an abuse. You got rid of that abuse. And you gave the American government more transparency. Fantastic. And then when you keep the rest, again, based on available evidence that I see in public, the overwhelming majority of USAID, then we would all have more confidence that we're spending that money in the right direction, both, again, morally, but for our own interest as well, right? So all the things that you guys are saying about, hey, let's make sure that we, handle this in a way that is transparent and gets rid of the corruption, I back completely. Last thing is other countries' reactions. Look, some countries are throwing us out for good reason because of some of the abuses that Mike mentioned. Some because of not so good reasons because they were against our interests, etc. And one of the countries that celebrated USAID being cut was China. They were thrilled because they're now going to use soft power in all of those countries, and they're going to pick up the slack and get the goodwill, get the natural resources, get the economic alliances. The reason they were thrilled is because they know that it was actually a good strategy, and now they're going to do it instead of us.
Can I respond to that? And I think, sorry, or unless Keith, you want to get in? Because
I wanted to take it in a different direction just a little. So if you want to respond to that, that's fine.
I'm going to have you respond to that real quick, Mike, and then we're going to pause for a brief sponsor message, okay?
Great. Yep. So a couple things on that. When I went on Rogan the second time after USAID was done, he asked me, okay, is the battle won on this with USAID? And I said, and he said, what's the biggest problem now? And I said, actually, DOD was the biggest problem both before USAID and after it. And you can't understand DOD without understanding USAID, because while it's easy to compare the $44 billion USAID budget with what is now effectively going to be $1 trillion Pentagon budget, it's very misleading to look at it in those terms, because USAID is not, the institutions that USAID sponsors are co-sponsored by other government agencies, State Department grants, by DOD itself. DOD has an entire, most people think that DOD is about kinetic military war. It's about tanks and planes and bombs. Actually, a huge proportion of what DOD does is what they call civil military, civil political. And this is about the civil society institutions in a country and the hearts and minds war that implicates national security issues. And so oftentimes the best thing to accomplish a military objective, such as building a military base or getting a country to provide funding to Afghanistan or Libya or Iraq or any places of concern by the U.S. military, the civil military branch of DOD will effectively co-sponsor USAID activity. They'll kick money to USAID funded or fronted institutions. And so you have a massive military vehicle built on top of these USAID programs. I'll give you a great example from 2021, Mark Milley's Special Forces Guide, their prospectus document in 2021, gave an example in Africa of a U.S. Army Special Forces soldiers driving down a road in a Western African country on the Atlantic Ocean. They see a billboard for a Chinese advertisement. They are concerned about the national security implications of allowing China to have access to an Atlantic Ocean port. So they alert the State Department. The State Department tries to negotiate with the African country's leadership in order to get the port shut down. The African country does not want to do it. So the Special Forces comes up with a game plan to inflame racial tensions between African workers and Chinese employers in the country. And in order to get this is an operation coordinated at the interagency level at Fort Bragg in North Carolina. What they do is they get their contacts in the African labor unions and in the youth groups there to take to the streets and riot. And the reason that they are able to do so while not being worried about being fired by their Chinese employers is because the DoD calls in USAID to do humanitarian job fairs to give them no-show paychecks. The world thinks that these are job fairs to give employment opportunities to underprivileged, malnourished Africans in West Africa. But what it's actually doing is assisting a U.S. Special Forces operation in order to get leverage against an African government in order to cancel the port construction. Now, you can make an argument that advances U.S. national security because the end result of that is preventing China from access to a U.S. port. But USAID is not doing a job fair there. It never is. And if it is, it should be able to publicly show us all of those documents. Another example of this, by the way, in 2015, there's a U.S. Army War College document that did a survey of the efficacy of USAID DoD programs. And one of the quotes by one of the two-star generals who was consulted on this report is that DoD prefers to work with USAID over the State Department, even though the State Department sets U.S. foreign policy and there's supposed to be tighter coordination through the White House National Security Council. But that military general said we prefer to work with USAID because USAID actually does stuff. They're on the ground, they provide more money, and they are sheltered from the knife fight in a toll booth, he said, that happens at the White House. So there's no bureaucratic red tape. When the Pentagon wants to get something done and they're worried the president might not approve and the State Department might not approve, they can just work directly with USAID and get it done. And this is how DoD can constantly play shell games with the numbers. For example, as one of the generals bragged after Trump lost in 2020, one of the generals came out and said we were constantly playing shell games with the numbers in Syria and in Iraq when Trump was trying to do withdrawals and a limited presence there. Well, all of these groups on the ground were being pumped up by USAID, and they get civil military funds at DoD, and those can be easily laundered. So you can't have your own government under control. All these other rogue agencies work as part of this USAID soup, and because USAID is the most secret of the agencies, it ends up being the end point for all that laundering.
Thank you, Mike. We're going to take a brief break for a sponsor message.
Now is the time to take advantage of the power of gold and silver to grow your wealth, whether you're an experienced investor or new to the game. These precious metals have a long history of being a safe haven for your savings, but they also offer growth potential, making them a wise investment choice. So where does the average investor go to buy gold and silver? That's easy. JM Bullion. JM Bullion is one of the most popular and most trusted precious metals retailers in the nation. We offer a huge selection of gold, silver, platinum, and palladium products that can be delivered to your door in safe, discreet, fully insured packaging. From 1 gram of gold to an entire mint box of silver, JM Bullion offers precious metals to suit every financial goal and budget. No matter your budget, now is the time to start investing in precious metals and start protecting yourself and your savings against these volatile markets. Visit jmbullion.com today to take a look at our wide variety of precious metals, rounds, coins, and bars, and find out how you can turn your savings into gold.
Welcome back, everybody. The next question I have is for Keith. At the beginning, you'd mentioned that foreign aid was not reformable in your opinion. So what alternative mechanisms, if any, would you propose to replace the role in foreign aid, specifically with what Cenk had mentioned with moral issues, national security, economics, and the American brand?
The primary thing that I would focus on is the concept of free trade. If you look at the countries we trade the most with, Mexico, Canada, and China, you see that this is not a result of the countries we give the most aid to were then able to trade the most with. We can have trade without the US government taking money from the domestic population and giving it to people in other countries. In the case of child mortality, we saw child mortality drastically drop in Western Europe and in America, not because there were other countries in the 1800s and early 1900s giving us foreign aid from their taxpayer base, but because we embraced a system that was much closer with private property, the right to contract, and voluntary exchange. This is how child mortality actually decreases once you allow for the nation's productive capacities to be unleashed and you're allowed to freely trade with other people. If you look at how just as the cost of computers and the cost of cell phones and the cost of televisions have drastically decreased and allowed more people to access those things because of a lot of free trade agreements that we do have with other countries, the same exact thing could be done with medicine. This is a genuine way to increase access to hundreds of millions of people worldwide through the concept of free trade. I do want to ask Cenk one thing, because I'm curious how we can differentiate between something that is currently bad and in need of reform versus something that is inherently bad and should be abolished. I'm thinking right after the IDF started bombing Rafah, after telling everyone in Gaza they got to get to the south so they could bomb the north, then they started bombing the south. Cenk said if the IDF tries to ethnically cleanse Palestinians into Egypt, that he would be so furious he would actually support a tax revolt. Am I remembering that correctly, sir? I don't want to put words in your mouth.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
So there is a point at which you can look at the actions of an organization and say, their actions are so egregious, there is so little accountability, reform would be so astronomically costly for so many people that it's much better to just make it so these groups can still get funding, but they have to do it through the voluntary market process. I can't get any money from the Young Turks unless I find a way to make a voluntary exchange with you guys. Just as Walmart and the Catholic Church and Amazon, big companies that they have big projects and they help a lot of poor people with the products and services they create. All I'm saying is take these aid agencies and turn them away from answering to the government, which has very little incentive to please consumers, and make them answer directly to consumers instead of allowing politicians to take from consumers and have the entrepreneurs start answering to politicians. It's the old expression, he who pays the piper calls the tune. So if customers are paying the piper, the businesses, well, we can complain. If they don't accept our complaints, we could go to a competitor. Governments don't face that discipline. So this is my justification. One, the amount of atrocities in Gaza, as you've outlined numerous times on Piers Morgan's show. It's not just the number of atrocities, but the incentives and constraints that the government is not disciplined with, that the market is. So that is my general explanation. Embrace free trade. Don't be sanctioning Russia, kicking them out of SWIFT. Donald Trump came out the other day and said, Iran's got a lot of oil that they could trade with. So now apparently it's okay for Iran to start trading. We should embrace free trade and reject foreign aid because of the incentives that producers face. We want them answering to customers, not to politicians.
Thank you, Keith. Would you like to respond, Mike or Cenk?
Sure, I'll respond to some of the things because he was addressing some of the stuff that I said. Sure. So, look, guys, we got to cut harmful things first, and then if you say there are harmful things within USAID, again, I'm super happy to cut that, right? So, to Keith's point there, I mean, we spend about half of the remaining USAID budget, the equivalent of half of it, to pay for a genocide in Gaza. How does that help anybody? Doesn't help anybody at all. And my God, it gets the whole world to hate us. So there's just a mountain of abuses within the government to cut, a mountain of waste, a mountain of corruption. And you guys are, in my opinion, attacking a program that has some of that. But the overall haystack, again, 25 million lives saved on just the HIV program alone. We're helping to fight cholera outbreaks, malaria, tuberculosis, so many of these things, maternal health, child health. Like, you're looking at the very worst place, in my opinion, to start the cuts and to throw out the entire program. If you said to me, throw out the entire program of helping Israel, I said, oh my God, that's a no-brainer. Of course, right? Because it's not because I don't think Israel can, use any help, but the great majority of that quote unquote help is military. And we've given over $34 billion in the last 12 months alone to Israel. And it doesn't even help Israel because we're enabling them, their worst instincts. And it's, causing grave harm to Israel, let alone the Palestinians, let alone the world, etc. So there are some programs that are nearly 100% wrong. And obviously, overwhelmingly wrong. And if you said, hey, yeah, but there's some things we help Israel with that maybe helps them have paid family leave, even though we don't have it, and universal health care, even though we don't have it. I'd say, well, I'm glad they have paid family leave and universal health care. But overall, the aid that we've given Israel has been about 96% harmful. So I just give that as one of literally hundreds of examples I can give you where, yeah, there is no baby. There's just toxic bathwater. Throw it out, right? USAID is among the worst places to do that because there's so many positive things that happen there. And the last thing in addressing what Keith said is that, look, brother, there's so many things that I agree with libertarians on these days, including anti-war. And, from your organization, Dave Smith, Scott Horton, amazing, wonderful work, right? But when you guys talk about just the markets will fix everything, let me just give you one quick example. I had the privilege of interviewing Jimmy Carter in his presidential library about right around the time where the Carter Foundation had nearly eradicated guinea worm disease. So this is a disease that's in the water in Africa and Asia. Most of us don't know about it because it doesn't affect us, but it affects millions and millions of people in the world, or it did. And a virus gets, not a virus, but a bacteria gets in the water and into your system once you drink it. And then worms form inside your body and they eventually break out. And it's just the most disgusting thing, but at least the infections, it's incredibly painful, leads to deaths, etc. And when I asked him, why did you pick that one, President Carter, to work on? He said, because there was no profit motive. Once you solve it, they can't keep selling drugs to help fix it. So if we didn't do it, no one was going to do it. So the markets don't solve everything. Markets solve a lot of things, and that's why I'm a capitalist. But they don't solve everything. That's why you need a government. That's why you need charitable organizations like the Carter Foundation. But they don't have enough resources to be able to solve all the problems that we're talking about here. And that's why, yes, sometimes you need the U.S. government to do wonderful things and not just awful things. And those wonderful things also have great advantages for us morally, economically, and security-wise.
Well, that would mean that any company or any group that's in the private sector, that would mean they have the right to issue taxes on the income of Americans. I could say, the Catholic Church has done so much to help people. The Protestant churches have done so much to help. Mormon churches have done so much to help. Walmart has given so many cheap goods to people at very low incomes. Therefore, Walmart should get $100 billion a year from taxpayer money, and they should continue to do that work. And every 4 years, we'll try and argue who the Walmart CEO should be. Notice you're writing a near blank check to people who no longer have to earn money on a voluntary basis. So my solution is voluntary charity. That's how you can actually meet the equilibrium between giving people enough money to meet their demand and try to influence people to behave in positive ways, to invest in things that are very productive. That's one means that charity can be achieved. And it allows people to opt out when things are so horrible. I mean, if we can't say that foreign aid is so bad because one, it's funding an ethnic cleansing operation in Gaza, and two, the guy getting the money for $100 billion in foreign aid, Vladimir Zelensky, came out on November 15th of 2022 and said, Russia just bombed Poland, a NATO country, and NATO must respond. Lloyd Austin later came out and said, this actually was a Ukrainian defense missile that killed 2 Polish civilians, but ultimately Putin is still responsible. So in defending foreign aid, you're claiming that some people have a right to take money without meeting demand in exchange. 2, they can fund a genocide and will just argue over where it should not be cut. And they can attempt to provoke a nuclear war with a nuclear power between Russia and America. At some point, you have to say, you know what? Instead of arguing for Jim Crow reform laws, we should abolish Jim Crow. Instead of saying the Ku Klux Klan needs a new Grand Dragon, it's an inherently evil organization that should not exist. Same thing applies to foreign aid.
Thank you, Keith. We do need to start wrapping up right now, so I'm going to have you each give sort of a closing statement on your views. Does that sound good? All right.
Yeah.
So I started with Keith before and ended with Mike, so I'll start with Mike.
Yeah. So I think that USAID is a totally rogue organization. It's a separate question about the one of foreign aid, because the structure of delivery of foreign aid is under the current system with USAID as an independent agency with no effective oversight or transparency, means that it has become essentially the place for the rogues gallery of folks at DOD, CIA, state to park operations that otherwise would be untenable to run out of there. I think that the position that I'm advocating is one that accomplishes partially the goals of that were addressed here tonight, or put forth tonight by both Keith and Cenk. Keith's concern about USAID, taking U.S. taxpayer dollars to manipulate the course of events in foreign countries, but without this could be done through trade and the like. Well, drastically downscaling the function of foreign aid while preserving some perhaps core essential functions or crisis capacities would go a long way towards addressing the scale of the corruption that I think that Keith is concerned about, or the scale of the misuse of funds. And as for Cenk's point about needing USAID and needing this foreign aid function because of its role in national security, national interest, competition with China and the like, I would note on that China point that we gave the USAID gave $15 million to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. We just had a public hearing in the DOGE committee just a month ago where one of the subject matter experts testified for about 10 to 15 minutes on the topic of how USAID actually helps China more than it helps us, because its initiatives drive companies towards businesses such as the clean energy space, where China dominates the minerals supply chain and processing, and various others. The Chamber of Commerce itself is now very tied to China, and much of the USAID funds that helps those companies is effectively deepening their ties with China. And then you have the issue that Cenk noted about the much bigger military budget that is a bigger concern than USAID. And to that I say, much of the military budget is only made possible because of USAID. The biggest champions of USAID are military contractors. They, starting with the lobby for it in 1995, when folks argued then that USAID should be shut down because the Cold War is over and there's no need for this. It was the military contractors through the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition who drove the expansion of USAID when arguably it should have been shut down. This is why John Bolton, who I presume both Cenk, Keith, and I are all not exactly number one fans of. John Bolton on Piers Morgan 2 months ago held up his USAID hand grenade that he got as an award while he ran policy and budget at USAID, and has been So it's interesting that I do think that deep down Cenk probably agrees with my position, and I'm sympathetic to many elements of what he laid out. What Cenk has argued for is the John Bolton position, and I don't think either of us want that. I think that the better solution is to have a much more streamlined, downsized USAID that starts from scratch. Meanwhile, while parking at the State Department where there is transparency, because, and this final point that I'll say here is another one of the points that Cenk laid out tonight is that in theory, Trump controls the government. Trump officials can just review all of the USAID files. It ain't that simple because everything USAID does moves through this plausible deniability cloak. 70% of its funds go through contractors and subcontractors, and they don't have records retentions policies. So much of the records correspondence is actually held at the contractor and subcontractor level and can be deleted after 30 days. And so there's no trace. And this is a big part of the DOJ standoff with USAID itself. The reason USAID was shut down rather than attempted to be reformed is because USAID forbade access to the Trump White House, access to documents, access to records, emails. So there was no choice because we actually couldn't see what was happening there. And as well as the classified documents that USAID had possession of. If USAID was not secretly acting as an intelligence arm for the same CIA that I think all three of us agree has gone rogue, why is there a SCIF at USAID? Why does it need to have access to sensitive classified information? Things can be better. Proceed with the reforms.
Thank you, Mike. Cenk.
Yeah. So first of all, beware of John Bolton giving you a grenade or Israelis giving you pagers. So those are not gifts I would accept. And I agree that Wuhan ain't nothing to mess with. Also true of Wu-Tang. So now, look, guys, I showed up for a debate on USAID, and I wound up in a debate about the CIA and the Pentagon and the Defense Department, et cetera, and foreign aid overall. And a lot of the, not just a lot, I think almost all the points you guys make about the abuses of the CIA, the lack of transparency, I totally agree with. But really, your issues, again, are with those departments and not with USAID. If they are misusing USAID, then great. Take that out. Route it out. To the point about Trump administration is being blocked from getting information. No, that's intolerable. And it doesn't matter if you're a Republican or a Democratic president. If I'm the president and somebody says to me, oh, I'm not going to give you that information, I'd say, wrong again, Bob. You will. Otherwise, you'll be fired instantly. No, there is no not giving information to the president. It doesn't matter which party he's in, right? And there is no CIA secrecy from the president. That should be absolutely intolerable, right? So the American people selected him, whether we like it or not. And by the way, whether we like it or not, they keep selecting Democrats and Republicans. And those are the representatives of the people. And they must hold each department accountable. But when you look at the different ways that we spend money and the different departments we have, for some reason, conservatives have made USAID, which has some of the best programs we do in it, the boogeyman. When I can show you a dozen boogeymen, maybe 100 boogeymen inside the U.S. government that are way, way worse. You guys have ironically picked a department that has a lot of wonderful things in it. And then talk about just completely eliminating it. No, slow your roll. Find what's actually problematic and take those out, right? And so, and again, you see here, all sides of the political spectrum agree on taking out things that are toxic, that are not transparent, that are counterproductive, right? And if you can find some of those in USAID, and I believe that you can, we're all going to agree with you on carefully taking those out and having it be accountable to the president. But guys, especially when, I mean, I've named now half a dozen on the one more program, but I could literally, again, give you hundreds of these within the U.S. government. The fact that we can't negotiate drug prices for Medicare costs us not just hundreds of billions. Over the long run, it costs us trillions of dollars. It's the most anti-free market thing in the whole world. It says you're not allowed to negotiate prices. That is a direct attack against capitalism. and costs us hundreds of billions of dollars a year. And it is direct corruption, big pharma buying off Republican and Democratic members of Congress, both of them. And then impotent presidents come in on both sides, go, oh, I wish I could change it, but I can't because the drug company own Congress. Well, brother, do something about it then. Whether you're Bush or Obama or Biden or Trump, do something about it. So with these enormously toxic programs that are nothing but corporate corruption, just sitting there totally unaddressed, to attack a program that has a proven track record of doing monumentally good things and saving millions of lives because it has some bad parts in it is not the right way to go. Take out the bad parts and keep the overwhelmingly good parts in one of the best parts of the U.S. government.
Mike, you look like you want to respond.
Where's the proof? You mentioned, for example, the public health programs and how many lives they saved. I just mentioned to you a scandal from the Obama USAID, not ancient history, where HIV programs in Latin America were used as, quote, the perfect excuse by USAID to recruit paramilitary guerrillas in order to topple the government. How many lives do you think that program publicly reported that it saved? You would not, if you were just reading the press release or an NGO assessment digesting whatever stats that those HIV prevention programs put out, you'd have said, hey, they saved 100,000 lives in that program. They didn't save those lives at all. I would like to see one award number, one program that you can identify, give me the grant number, the award ID, and show me what it actually did that was positive.
So, Mike, just real quick, we gotta let Keith talk. But
okay, I'm sorry.
So, like PEPFAR, that's the HIV program that Bush started. Reports are that it has saved 25 million lives. You're saying some of those reports might be inaccurate, and maybe it didn't save 100,000 lives in one country when they said they did, and it was a covert program instead. But are you saying it saved no lives? It saved 23 million lives, 12 million lives, whatever the number is, it's a giant number.
It's kind of weird that corresponds with the breakout of about a dozen different civil wars in African countries and the sudden presence of giant U.S. military and special forces boots on the ground that coincided during that period. Because as Henry Kissinger wrote in his 2000 book, and this is also echoed by Peter Hotez in his article series, Vaccines as an Instrument of Soft Power, arguing that it was actually humanitarian interventions in public health that allowed U.S. access to boots on the ground in places that we would otherwise be barred by the local government for. When you need to put in tens of thousands of public health workers, you need security forces. You need a military support for them as well. And then you pump up an economy that ends up lobbying the local government for governance change, as we did all over Africa during the AIDS outbreak. This was seen as a way, one of the reasons the State Department and USAID and the DOD loved the AIDS program was because it gave us a chance to get U.S. favored institutions, U.S. vassal institutions on the ground in Africa without any other justification around terrorism or around drugs or it gave us a pretense for a humanitarian intervention. And what I would like to see is honest numbers. If it really did what it said it was doing, they should have no problem showing us all PEPFAR-related programs that were coordinated with DOD, all PEPFAR-related programs that coordinated with the U.S. State Department, with the Central Intelligence Agency, with the NGOs. If it's really public-facing and it's really saving babies, show us the baby. I want to see it.
I'll bring the baby next time. Keep the healthcare, lose the CIA.
Keith, go ahead.
Yeah, fortunately, there are a lot of companies that voluntarily produce products and services that can be used in healthcare. If we look at healthcare specifically, we can look at things that are insured, which the state heavily regulates, a lot of surgeries, a lot of cancer treatments, or you can look at cosmetics, which are less regulated and not covered by insurance. We see a much more drastic decrease in the cost of cosmetics because it's on much more of a free market. There's more competition. When there's more competition, the greediest person in the world still has to have a lower price. Walmart is extremely greedy, but they still have lower prices because that's how you're able to increase the access that people have to your products and services. So again, all of these ends could be achieved voluntarily. How many left-wingers are there on planet Earth? Can they not have a GoFundMe to support all of the operations that they are really so allegedly passionate about without siphoning some of the money to fund an operation that's just engaged in ethnic cleansing in Gaza? Consider these words were spoken by Lindsey Graham. Here's the mindset of someone who has access to a tax base where people, regardless of how they feel, don't have the right to opt out. Lindsey Graham said, he's speaking to a brigade of fighters in Ukraine in 2017. He said, "Your fight is our fight. 2017 will be the year of offense. All of us will go back to Washington and we will push the case against Russia. Enough of Russian aggression. It is time for them to pay a heavier price. Our fight is not with the Russian people, but with Putin. Our promise to you is to take your cause to Washington, inform the American people of your bravery, and make the case against Putin to the world." This is the mindset that you get. These are the psychopaths you attract when there is such a large amount of money with so little accountability. Dr. Ben Powell from the University of Texas was summarizing an article in Parade. He summarized it as follows. Overall, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development countries contributed aid to every one of Parade magazine's 20 worst dictators. Combined, these leaders received nearly $55 billion in aid. The United States contributed to 19 of the 20 worst dictators. I don't know how many empirical examples of atrocities we would have to put forth between Mike and myself to get people to say that this is something inherently bad. I mean, I've seen a number of interviews with women who were in violently abusive relationships, and they almost all say the same thing of, well, he gave me so many benefits. He gave me a car. He gave me access to a house. At some point, even though you're reaping some benefits from an abusive relationship, you have to say the costs are too damn high and we have to disassociate with these people, whether it's an abusive boyfriend or people actively provoking world wars with Iran, Russia, China, and engaging in an ethnic cleansing operation in Gaza. Support the abolition of funding foreign aid. The people who control the money don't have the knowledge or incentives to ever provide a good service. In opposition, you can support not sanctioning other countries and encouraging free trade.
Thank you so much, Keith. So thank you, everyone, for attending this debate. I would have loved to continue this conversation for like another couple hours. I still have so many questions. Gentlemen, where can our listeners find you and help support your work?
You can find me at libertarianinstitute.org. Scott Horton and I have been working on this institute so people can go there and use our search engine to look up anything they're curious about when it comes to the freedom position. Generally, our claim is that for the same reason you should have religious freedom, even though there can be downsides to people choosing their own religion, people still have the right to do so. So we advocate the policies of anti-war and decriminalizing all capitalist acts between consenting adults. Check us out at libertarianinstitute.org. And you can read my book, Domestic Imperialism, 9 Reasons I Left Progressivism. Cenk Uygur says it's his favorite book of all time, so definitely read it.
Thank you, Keith. And Scott Horton is amazing. He's like a human encyclopedia. I would definitely recommend following him for all of the listeners out there. Cenk, where can people find you and help support your work?
Yeah, so Young Turks is on almost every platform that you watch. But so you just type in Young Turks or TYT anywhere you watch news, get your videos. But an easy way to find us is we're live Monday through Friday, 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern on YouTube. So just go to the Young Turks channel on YouTube, 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern every day. Get all of your news there. And then politically, actually with the Libertarians, we started unitedagainstwar.com. So make sure that all of your politicians are held accountable. if they vote for war. So that's unitedagainstwar.com. And then if you're populist left or populist at all, Rebellion PAC is the place for you. And we actually try to fight the waste, fraud, and abuse inside the government and serve the average person and not the donor class. And that's rebellionpac.com. Come join the rebellion.
Thank you, Cenk. And as a fellow anti-John Boltonist, I'll definitely check that out. Mike, where can people find you and help support your work?
Best place to find me is on X at Mike Ben Cyber. My foundation is at foundationforfreedomonline.com. You can see detailed reports about the censorship industrial complex and its many scandals and exposés that we've blown up there. Thank you guys for making the time tonight. I thought this was a fun, lively conversation. And thank you to Zerohedge and for Josie for hosting.